Welcome to this video session on understanding CNAs and reserve studies. Please take a moment to review the disclaimers before we start. Welcome. My name is Emily, and I'll be presenting the session today. I'm the Housing Director for the San Francisco Community Land Trust. SFCLT was formed in 2003 to combat displacement pressures in San Francisco. Today, we own and steward 16 buildings with about 180 units of permanently affordable housing for either rent or limited equity ownership. Our properties are located in San Francisco. For the past 2 years, we have been lending technical support to other CLTs and small developers across the Bay Area, including support for asset management, brokerage, and pro forma development support. This video is part of our technical support services. One caveat around the information provided is that it's based on our experience in San Francisco. Other counties, cities, and lenders may have different requirements. We hope that you use this video as a starting point to build vocabulary and basic understanding, and then tailor this information to your own specific scenario. So today we're going to learn about a few different kinds of needs assessments. We're going to define some common terms and abbreviations. We'll review an example capital funding plan, identify missing information from the report, and identify some real-life examples for use within acquisitions and asset management. To get started, when you're acquiring a property, or preparing the scope of work for a rehab project, or preparing an annual property budget, you'll likely be required to reference a needs assessment report of some kind. A needs assessment report provides property owners, developers, and lenders with a comprehensive, forward-looking roadmap for maintaining a property's value and functionality over a specific period of time, which is typically about 10 to 20 years. These reports are conducted by a qualified and experienced third-party consulting firm and are typically renewed about every 7 to 10 years. The reports are often informed by a physical property inspection, by information about current reserves, and information about historical repairs and maintenance that's provided by the property management and construction management teams. Needs assessment reports can be broken down into two major categories: physical needs and financial needs. A physical needs assessment, in short, evaluates what needs to be done and when. It evaluates the condition of the major building components and systems, like the structural components, the building envelope, mechanical systems, utilities, common area components, etc. It's really important to note that these physical assessments aren't capturing the repair and maintenance of components. So we're not talking about paint touching up, roof patching, light bulb replacements. This physical needs assessment is evaluating when an entire component will need to be fully replaced. There are two types of physical needs assessment reports. First is literally called a physical needs assessment, or PNA. This is a short-term assessment. It evaluates the current physical condition of building components. It identifies immediate and near-term deficiencies and replacement needs, and it evaluates needs that are typically just from present to maybe 3 years out at most. The second type of physical assessment is called a capital needs assessment, or a CNA. It's similar to a PNA in that it evaluates the current physical condition of building components. and it identifies immediate deficiencies, but it additionally forecasts future replacement needs. And it's typically looking at the life cycle of components over the next 20 to 30 years. When it comes to financial need assessments, we're talking specifically about a reserve study, which in short is how much money is needed and when. A reserve study evaluates the current replacement reserve fund and compares it against your CNA. It identifies if your current reserve fund is adequate for the current and future replacement needs of your property. It's a planning tool to help guide how much money should be saved based on when it needs to be spent. And it's forecasting your financial needs for the next 20 to 30 years. San Francisco Community Land Trust typically gets what's called a capital funding plan for our properties, which includes both a CNA and the reserve study. A couple more definitions that would be helpful to know before we start. We already covered these on the previous slide, but I just want to reiterate that when you hear me say CNA, I'm talking about a capital needs assessment. And when you hear me say PNA, I'm talking about a physical needs assessment. You may hear me mention replacement reserves throughout this session. Replacement reserves is a dedicated fund for future major expenses as identified in the CNA. This account is often required by lenders, and it's where owners will set aside funds over time for major expenses, like replacing a roof. A CNA is going to identify these major expenses, and then a reserve study will calculate how much money is needed in your replacement reserve at any given time so that you can afford those expenses. Existing or estimated useful life, EUL, is an estimate of time in years that a component can be expected to serve its intended function. For example, a brand new roof is expected to last for about 20 years before it needs a full replacement. And then RUL is remaining useful life. This is the estimated time in years that a component can continue to serve its intended function. For the example of the roof, if we say that it was installed in 2016, then its remaining useful life is about 10 years. All right, so let's get into an actual example of a capital funding report. Let me pull it up here. Our vendor that we love using in San Francisco is called Association Reserves, and they prepare for us this capital funding plan, which includes both a CNA and a reserve study. And this is called full because we are, at this particular example, we requested this report when we were in the process of acquiring a property. And so the vendor had never been to the property before. They were going to need to do a lot of extra work to set this up in their system, pull together all the financial assumptions, and do a very detailed walk of the property. Typically, how the process works is the vendor, Association Reserves, will come out and visit the site. And it's a really comprehensive site visit. So they will go inside every unit. They will be building their component list. So they'll be counting the number of fixtures and outlets, and they'll be taking measurements. What's the floor area for the carpet in the common area hall, for example. And then they will go back to their office and they'll request information from the property management company, any maintenance staff. They're trying to understand what repairs have been done in the past at this property if there are common issues that come up every year that we should anticipate, if there are any unique conditions, and what are the goals for the property. And then from the asset manager, they will request financial information about the reserve funds that are available. There's always a handy table of contents, so please reference that if you're skipping ahead to different portions of the report. So it starts out with this 3-minute executive summary, and it's just a high-level reserve summary. So I'm going to go ahead and zoom in here a bit so we can really dig into this. Since we are acquiring this property, we do not have an existing reserve balance. So our starting reserve balance is 0. What would we need today in order to be fully funded is $402,160. This is the ideal amount in order to address all the immediate repairs and be well funded for any future issues. And so because we don't have anything, we have an average reserve deficit per unit. And we're 0% funded right now. And based on all the analysis they do, they recommend that starting in 2024, we monthly contribute $2,300. And just a note on the date, this reserve study, I believe, was done at the end of 2023. So year 1 of the reserve study is 2024. They also recommend, because we're starting from 0, that we have an initial deposit of $364,000 into our reserve account. Because it's not funded at all currently, this is a high-risk property right now. Some assumptions that they make throughout the report, they assume that the interest on our reserves will accrue at 1.5%. And then they are assuming that our annual inflation rate over the next 20 years is going to be 4%. Okay, so this is kind of where we're starting at with our capital plan. And then we have our continuation of the executive summary. This is a summary of the component list. This is essentially a P&A. These are the immediate and short-term repairs needed. These are all the components that were identified in the site visit and how many remaining useful life years are left out of the standard useful lives. And this is the current average cost to completely replace that item. So for the wood fence, even though it has 5 years left, if we were to replace it today, it would be about $9,900. So this lists every component, and the ones highlighted in yellow are considered immediate needs. They are in a deteriorated condition and they need to be replaced as soon as we acquire the property. We will use this list to inform the scope of work for our initial rehab once we acquire the property. All right, then the document goes into an introduction. And I'm not going to go over this with you today, but just so you understand what's in here. And if you ever get your own capital plan report, I recommend that you read through this fully. This breaks down their philosophy around how they put together the capital plan. They started as a foundation with the list of components, and then they compared it against the reserve fund that we have and identified how strong our current reserve fund is. And then from there, they built a funding plan for us. So this component list, this is the CNA. And then the reserve funding strength and funding planning, that's the reserve study portion. So they talk about their methodology, how they got to those numbers, how they assessed the physical assets, which ones they included or didn't, how they assessed the useful life and remaining useful life, and how they got those cost estimates. And then, just some information about how to know how much reserves is enough for your property. How much should you contribute? What's the recommended funding goal? Then we get into site inspection notes. This is just a couple key photos to identify the property, and then a note on any areas that were not accessible. For this particular walk, they were able to access everywhere on the site. If there were some units that they hadn't been allowed into, they would make note of that here. Okay, projected expenses. So this next section, a couple sections, provide a variety of charts that help inform a pro forma, and they help an asset manager keep track of the health of the reserves. So this annual reserve expenses diagram is a visual diagram of the expenses that we can expect every year. So in year 1, 2024, we can expect we're going to have a big rehab project. Many of the components are going to need replacement. Then, because of all that work done up front, we don't have many repairs or replacements anticipated for the next few years. 2034, we've got about a little over 50,000. 2044, we've got about 150,000. And it's really in 2049 where we're going to be needing to replace the majority of the components again. Next, we've got the reserve fund status and the recommended funding plan. Zoom in on this. So this diagram, the annual reserve funding, this is showing essentially just the annual contributions that they're recommending, plus that 3%, a 3% increase year over year. So we might be starting with 23,000 a month for 2024, and they're really recommending that our contributions to the reserve grow as the years progress. And I think it's important to note that because on some of our pro formas when we acquire, the assumption shown is that the replacement reserve contribution is a flat contribution quarterly or annually, and it's not growing at a percentage. So we might talk to Association Reserve about modifying that assumption so that we can see more accurately what's the impact if we're not increasing our contributions year over year. All right, next we've got this 30-year cash flow chart. The blue bars represent the target fully funded balance. So in an ideal world, we would already have $402,000. And then we would, following a spend down and annual contributions, you can see what our target is for us to be considered fully funded. And then this green line represents where the plan is actually recommending our contributions. So our annual contributions and then the spend down. And actually for a majority of the time, we hope to have more than the target balance. If we look at it in a different way at the percent funded, in order to maintain fully funded reserves, between 2029 and 2048, we really want to be overfunded for a bit. And that will help us keep this property stabilized for beyond 30 years. The next section is our reserve component list detail. So this lists every single component that was identified at the property and its useful life, its remaining useful life, and the current cost to fully replace it. So at this particular property, we had approximately 180 gross square feet of wood deck. And Typically, it would last around 25 years. It's in pretty deteriorated condition and needs to be replaced. And we anticipate it'll cost about $17,500. And I just want to note on here that if we look at the wood fence, about 120 linear feet, this one actually has, according to the report, 5 years left of remaining useful life. But this current cost estimate is just reflecting if we were to replace the component today, what would we expect that cost to be? So it's not factoring in what it'll cost 5 years from now. So I just want to make that clear. One other thing to note that I find this list very useful for the quantities. So if I'm getting a bid, if I'm planning ahead on a project and looking to repaint my building, I find it useful to already have an estimate of about 3,300 gross square feet. So I can sort of estimate that maybe it'll be $27,000, but when I call up a few painting contractors, I can get some initial ballpark numbers from them just by giving them this approximate square footage. All right, and then next, we have the chart of the fully funded balance. And what I don't use this one very often, but what this is showing us is that if we look at the wood fence again, for example, to fully replace the wood fence today would be $9,900. However, since it's only about 20 years old and there's still 5 years left on it, what we need to have in our fund right now is actually only $7,920. And then the assumption is by the time we hit that year 5, we will have the full amount to replace the fence. So the fully funded balance is really looking at what do you need to have in your reserves today in order to afford the immediate needs plus a portion of the future needs. All right, and then next we have the component significance. So this chart, again, I don't often use this. What it's looking at is for each component, what's the useful life and the cost estimate to replace it, and then kind of break that cost down over its useful life. So for the wood deck, every year it's costing me $700, and that represents almost 4% of my replacement reserve budget. I think the useful information that you could take away from this is if you're looking at this building, repainting your building exterior, you can see that this accounts for about 15% of that replacement budget. And that's not necessarily because of how much it costs, but the frequency. You're doing this repaint every 10 years. So if I have a property that is underfunded and I'm making a plan for the next couple of years, I might put a small amount into my operating budget for proactive maintenance and try to extend the useful life of the exterior paint for another couple of years because I know it's such a big chunk of money for me. Next, we have the 30-year reserve plan summary. So this compares the recommended reserve plan versus the ideal. And it's a good idea for the asset manager to monitor your actual reserve balance against the plan. So how do we read this? So up here we just have the assumptions that are going into this plan. We're assuming 1.5% interest rate and 4% inflation on the cost of the component replacements year over year. So we've got each year listed, and then we have our starting reserve balance. And so this column reflects probably our actual balance in the reserve account. And then we have the fully funded balance, and this is the ideal. So in an ideal world, we were starting out already with 402,000 in our replacement reserves. But really where we're starting is with $0. And so that puts us at a high risk. And monthly for the first year, we intend to be contributing $2,300 a month. So that adds up to $27,000 in our reserve contributions. And initially we're going to need a special infusion of $364,000. And we'll earn a little bit of interest. And we plan to spend in our rehab $387,200. So starting in 2025, we'll have a pretty small balance in that reserve account compared to where we ideally would be. And so our contributions are going to increase by 3%. We will start gaining more interest. We won't spend anything for 2025, and so we have a greater balance in 2026. And so that's kind of how you read the report. We can see that by the year 27, we're in a pretty good position for our replacement reserves, at 80% funded. And then by year 2030, hopefully we've hit 100% funded. And so this starting reserve balance column is what the asset manager might want to just evaluate compared to actuals every year to see, are we tracking to where we kind of need to be for the property. The next section is the 30-year income and expense detail. I find this section to be the most useful, especially for asset management planning. So this is showing us our income, our total income for each year based on our reserve contributions and any one-time infusions and our interest earned. And then it's showing us what expenses should be planned for that year. So in year one, we're really replacing many of the components of this property. $387,000 worth of work in year one. And then in the next 4 years, we don't have any replacement work planned. Then when it gets to 2029, we have some minor work. We probably need to replace a fence by then, maybe seal and repair the rear stairs. 2032, we've got some work to replace exterior doors. And just to be clear, these are all estimates based on, in part, opinion and a visual inspection. So if your pro forma needs, money to be spent in 2031 instead of 2032, it's not a huge deal to adjust the year that work happens. Another thing that's helpful to look at, let me skip to another year. Okay, 2034, got about $55,000 worth of work here. And you notice we're doing the building exterior repaint, and then 2 years later, we're kind of repainting all the interior surfaces. It's useful to look at this and plan. Perhaps you have a relationship with a painter, and they would give you a discount for doing the entire building. And so you might think, well, combine all the work from 2036 into 2034 then. Have a slightly bigger project, but I can save money on it. Also, I can save that 4% inflation. So there is some flexibility throughout the years. The final part of this package is where they they go through each component, share a photo of what that component was that they identified. They'll have the useful life, the remaining life, and then like a best case and a worst case scenario for the replacement of that component. They'll have the quantity. They'll have notes if there are any repairs that they're aware of, and then just some comments about how you might maintain that over time, or what you might need to keep in mind, like, for the deck, you might need to consider having a qualified contractor do an assessment every couple years. So this is useful for confirming that you know what they're talking about with their general components, for informing your maintenance plan, and then if you are preparing a scope of work, just for confirming the gross square footage and kind of what your best and worst pricing scenarios are. Here's another page. I've got exterior lights here, 9 fixtures. And on the comments, there was an assumption that these were functional because they were observed during the daylight hours. So we don't know for sure. And then the cost source for this component was their database. All right, so that brings us to the end of our report review. And it brings me into the next part, which is what's missing from these reports. And one of the first things I can point out for you here, they had a component for the mailboxes, and you notice there's no best case and worst case. And they noted it here because typically mailboxes don't really need replacement. They can be maintained and repaired. You can repair the locks and the hinges and just keep it clean. However, in San Francisco, we have a lot of break-ins, a lot of mail and package theft. Someone could come here with a screwdriver, just pop this open and take the mail out. So at many of our properties, we see this style of mailbox, and we know that we're going to want to replace it with a high security mailbox. And that's going to cost a significant amount of money. In addition to just the cost of the mailbox, we may have to reframe the wall behind. We will need to hire someone to redo the stucco. If there's lead paint in the wall, we might need to abate it. So that information is missing from this report. Let me just drop this report down. Other items that aren't typically included is the cost of scaffolding, and then electrical upgrades that are triggered when you install new appliances or upgrade your lighting. So these are just a couple examples of scope of work that might be triggered by a seemingly straightforward CNA project. Other things that are missing, soft costs. A CNA does not consider soft costs. These are the general contractor's overhead and profit, permit fees, design fees, inspection fees, construction management fees, relocation costs. So soft costs are not included in a CNA. And then funding source requirements, like prevailing wage requirements. If you have to hire a local business or a small business, these requirements are typically attached to your funding source. They come from your lender, and they are unique to your location, the project type. Other things that aren't included in the CNA are mandates and ordinances. For example, in San Francisco specifically, we have a lot of properties identified for a soft story seismic retrofit. We may have properties with balconies and decks that need to be inspected and structurally upgraded. We have facade inspection ordinance, and then many of our properties require a fire alarm sounder upgrade. So being aware of the local mandates and ordinances, and making sure that you're capturing them because they are not listed in the CNA. And then the other category of missing information is insurance requirements. So currently in San Francisco, our property insurance inspections are requiring us to upgrade electrical panels and breakers. And there may be other components that they notice and require a replacement for. And that's not something that a CNA will identify and anticipate. So I think the big takeaway from this slide is that every location, every lender, every property is unique. And so just consider carefully what additional work might need to happen or might be triggered on the property, and make sure it's included in addition to what is being recommended by the CNA. So let's take a moment just to talk about some real life uses. So on the acquisition side, the CNA can confirm some of the initial assumptions that were made before the due diligence phase. So before you placed an offer, you had made some assumptions about the general physical health of the building, the amount of immediate rehab work that would be required, the rehab that would be required year over year. And so these kinds of assessments can confirm and inform those assumptions. The CNA is also put directly into the pro forma. It helps prove out the financial feasibility of the acquisition. And we have a video you can reference called Performas for Affordable Housing Preservation. And that talks about how you can take the CNA and put it directly into your pro forma. And just a note on that. So typically, what the basic package that you pay for a CNA and a reserve study, the deliverable is a PDF file like the one we went through. I would actually recommend, in addition, asking that your vendors provide you with an Excel that has the pro forma CNA in it. So this format can be copied and put directly into your pro forma. It has each of the components. It has their existing useful life, the remaining useful life, the high and low and average replacement cost, the number of units, and then it's got the immediate needs, and then broken out every year the amount of work required. Okay. So that's an additional cost, and I highly recommend that you request that whenever you're getting a CNA report done. Okay, back to the acquisition side. So if there is an initial rehab that's planned at the time of acquisition, then the CNA can inform or confirm the scope of work that's being wrapped into the CNA, or sorry, that's being wrapped into the rehab. So you can, sometimes you might have forgotten that you need to include a bathroom rehab from one of the units. And so reading through the CNA can remind you of those, that additional scope that should be wrapped in immediately. On the asset management side, the CNA can inform the annual budget and your CapEx plan for the upcoming year. Can identify components that need replacement, and you can balance it with your operating, repairs, and maintenance budget. For example, if you're looking ahead next year and you can see that a roof replacement is needed and you don't have the funds, then you might put more money into your operating repair budget for a roof repair and help extend, give you an extra 2 or 3 years on the roof replacement. The CNA can be a reference point for the health of your replacement reserves. So when you're doing your monthly, quarterly, annual financial reviews, you can check it against the funding plan to see, are we on track with the funding plan identified in the reserve study, or are we really underfunded? And then at that point, some decisions need to be made about what to prioritize in the coming years, or maybe you can look for green funds or other incentives to leverage. The CNA and reserve study can inform your expense approvals. An item could be a reserve expense. So if your property manager is sending you a quote to replace a refrigerator, if there isn't money in the operating budget for it, might be something that you take out of the replacement reserves instead. And also, if you see that it's nowhere near its end of its useful life, you might push back on the property manager and see if there's a way it can be repaired instead of replaced. You can use the CNA to inform the scope of work for your contractors to get ballpark budgets. You can use that fixture count or the gross square footage to get ballpark numbers for budgeting purposes. And then also, you can look at the CNA and the reserve study, and you can project when might be good future refinance opportunities. So in 10 years, you might see that you have $300,000 worth of replacement work anticipated, and you can tell that your reserves are not funded adequately for that. And so you might consider in year 10 a refinance event. Well, that is the conclusion of my presentation today. Thank you for joining. I hope this has been informative and given you a lot to think about. Feel free to reach out and ask any questions or request any clarifications that might be needed.